Just a quick recap. I'd love you guys to sort of post some questions, hopefully in a non-offensive way, if that's all right. We're going to sort of look at what advantages you can take from being in lockdown and how you might be able to improve things in the long term. So we've got a number of things that we want to cover. I've done a bit about me. So I want to touch a little bit on nutrition, on our injury prevention, conditioning and our return to sport. Like I said earlier, please bear in mind this, when I'm talking about this sort of stuff, some of it you might want to implement, some of it you won't want to implement, some of it you'll think has got nothing to do with you at the minute, but it might help other people. So please bear all of this in mind as you're going forward with this sort of thing. Let's see if I rotate you, does that work a little better? Oh, no. Okay. So let's start by looking at nutrition. I think pretty much what we want to do is really make sure that we're utilising our nutrition to the best of our abilities at the moment. Certainly, we're in a period where immunity is going to be high on the list of everyone's thoughts at the minute, and so we term eating the rainbow as a really good way of making sure that we're getting the right vitamins and minerals into us. I think what I'd probably suggest is that for most of us, we don't eat enough fruit and veg, and when we look at portion sizes in a bit, we'll sort of have an idea of what we should be eating. And I think for the vast majority of us, if we're able to improve vitamin and mineral content, then we'll certainly be able to have a better immunity to this current coronavirus. And don't forget, at the minute, there is some thought that with the coronavirus out there at the minute, we should be wary that a number of other viruses might well jump on the back of corona and sort of piggyback off that. So I think for the majority of us, really making sure that we're eating the rainbow, as they say, will aid that. Whilst we're in a period of lockdown, we're probably not doing as much exercise as normal, and therefore we sometimes drop off a little bit from our protein intake. What I certainly would suggest to most people is that we don't eat enough protein. For the vast majority of our athletes, they're working at such a high level that we need to be able to replenish our muscle fibres. We need to help our recovery with protein, and protein's a really important source of amino acids to help our muscles and joints, etc., recover. So what I'd like to impart to you guys really is that in general we probably don't eat enough protein, and therefore this is a good time to sort of experiment with what protein works for you. Some people like red meat, some people don't like red meat, some people don't like fish, etc. But there are numerous sources of protein out there that it'll be worthwhile sort of trying. What I'd also say to you is, if you happen to be vegetarian or vegan, then your sources of protein need to be of a high level, but you also need to be well aware of the protein content within those sources of protein. So, for instance, things like pulses, whilst they have a greater number of a good amount of protein in them, you have to eat an awful lot of beans to be able to match the amount of protein that you find in, say, a chicken breast. So well worth doing your research around what protein sources you want as an individual, and then how that might best be replicated by yourself in the foods that you eat. I'll come on to hydration in a little bit. We sort of touched a little bit on vitamins and minerals. It's probably the vast majority of my work is in basketball, and in basketball we probably have a bit of an issue with vitamin D levels. So for a number of sports that are sort of indoor sports, as I would put them, the vitamin D levels of those athletes tends to be a little bit lower. Swimmers, for instance, are another example. A great source of vitamin D comes directly from the sun. So if you're outside, especially in the weather at the moment, well worth topping up your vitamin D levels. Vitamin D has a really good effect on our immunity and will help us boost that, but also it will help with bone development and bone density moving forward. So For the vast majority of people that do indoor sports, you probably go to the gym, you do your S&C session in the gym environment, then you carry on onto the court in basketball terms, or go to this pool or some other indoor activity, and your vitamin D levels might be a little bit low. So worth thinking about foods that might contain extra vitamin D, oily fish for instance, or green veg. They tend to have relatively high proportion sizes of vitamin D. When we're thinking about vitamins and minerals, we often class that in our world as supplementation. I think if you're not training as you normally would do, the use of supplements probably wouldn't necessarily be 100% advocated, especially supplementation of protein. Certainly you would hope that you're getting the vast majority of your vitamins and minerals and extra protein from your normal diet, and not having to take shakes or anything like that. We'll come back to portion sizes in a bit, but I just wanted to touch on junk food. It's really, really tempting, isn't it, at the moment to graze, and we can graze on biscuits, cakes, apples, pears, whatever. Your choice of what you graze on will have a massive influence on your diet as a healthy athlete. In essence, we know now that junk food, in a sort of generic sense, has an effect on your hormones that is quite surprising. I was quite surprised by this. Effectively, the more junk food you eat, the higher a certain hormone is in your body, and that hormone has an influence on you to choose more poor diet choices. I.e., the more junk food you eat, the more you want more junk food. And so this perpetuating cycle carries on. We're in a time where you guys as athletes can change your behaviours, mainly because there's a lot less options for junk food at the moment. So what would be really interesting is if you know yourself that you are a little bit prone to the odd chocolate biscuit or the odd McDonald's, now that you're not having that much, then just see how well you feel in yourself and see what your diet choices are like. Will you go away from this sort of thing and start to pick up the apple or the pear rather than the chocolate bar or the biscuits? Up to you guys. Like I said at the start, this is entirely your athletic capabilities. It's entirely up to you what you choose, but that's just a little bit of insight into what the scientists are telling us, i.e. junk food perpetuates and makes you potentially want to eat more junk food. Okay, looking at hydration, this is just a very generic urine colour chart. I bet most of you thought on Saturday morning you wouldn't necessarily be looking at your own urine, but I think if you want to be a top level athlete, you really, really need to realise that our hydration levels will have a massive effect on your on a number of things. Your alertness and your ability to recover will be affected by it, but secondly, we know that with dehydrated athletes there is a massively higher increase in injury risk the more dehydrated we are. So using a urine colour chart like this is quite a nice way to see what your hydration levels are like. It's one of the simplest ways really, and many people will be using these on a daily basis to see how well hydrated they are. That's from an athletic perspective. From a current coronavirus perspective, your saliva will act as another barrier against bugs and things like that you don't want to come into your body. So what I would certainly suggest to you guys, if you can maintain your hydration levels, then saliva will act as a secondary barrier to infection. So it's well worth maintaining good hydration. Urine colour charts, I mean, they're fairly simple. Basically, the darker your urine, the more dehydrated you are. But if you're training, and I'm sure a number of you do this, but if you were to weigh yourself prior to your training session and then weigh yourself immediately afterwards, worth noting that for a lot of our athletes, we would suggest if you lose a kilo of fluid in terms of sweat during your training session, you need to replenish that fluid by about 1.5 litres of fluid. And we're not talking beer and alcohol, we're talking your water. So you'll be surprised, some of our senior men in basketball will lose potentially up to 3 kilos during a training session or a game. So that's an awful lot of water that they're going to have to sort of drink over the next couple of hours, but it is well worth sort of mentioning that as a bit of a tip, really. When we're looking at portion sizes, so I think most of us, we would class ourselves as having or being on rest days at the moment. So if we look at our rest days, our fruit and veg portion has to be increased realistically. We're not going to need the carbs and the protein as much to help us recover in this time period. What I would say to you as well is that from an elite perspective, we might consider ourselves fortunate not to have too many athletes that come out the other end of this lockdown period with extra body weight, shall we say. Now, that's just the nature of the beast, really. We're at home, we are grazing a bit more, so we are putting more calories into our body, and our body is going to convert those into fat unless we use them. So just be very mindful of our portion sizes. But as we move forward into the playing season or training more often, certainly you want to look to potentially increase your carb amount during your meal times. And if we just go back briefly to the protein element, there's a large amount of protein on a normal plate of food that you guys as athletes need to be able to take in. So just have a little quick think about the amount of protein that you have in your diet as a general rule of thumb. Most of us don't have a huge amount of protein, for instance, in the mornings with breakfast. So these are sort of areas that often athletes sort of maybe don't utilise as best as they can do. So let's look a little bit at our injury prevention. Okay, so we're looking at a time period now where we are 4 to 5 weeks into a lockdown. I suspect we've probably got another 4 to 5 weeks still to go. As I said right at the start, you guys need to see this time period as an advantage. How can you gain advantages in your own physical health during this time? So what a lot of us do, especially in team sports, is that we might have an ankle injury or a hamstring injury during the season, and we do the minimum required to get us back onto the court, onto the pitch, onto whatever you're doing. Now that you're in this lockdown period, my suggestion heavily would be to look back over the last season or over the last year or so and work out what injuries you've had and whether you've rehab them to the best of your ability. There's huge amounts of evidence out there to say once you've had an injury, you're very likely to have another injury moving forward in that same place. So it would be well worth getting in touch with someone just to try and improve your rehab. A little bit of a plug here. Obviously, you can get in touch with Bristol Physio at any time. We've got online appointment booking systems, so feel free to jump on that if you need any advice. But certainly from my perspective, I would be encouraging a lot of you to look at your previous injuries and work out where you need to improve. And a simple home rehab program will probably get you on the right path. For a lot of athletes, in whatever sport you come from, commonalities in terms of what things you need to work on are your core, in inverted commas, because not many people like that phrase, core, your flexibility and your stability. Those three elements, if you've got those three in your repertoire and you're good at them, then very commonly you'll find a reduction in your injury rate. So for you and your sport, well worth talking to your coach or strength and conditioning coach or therapist that might be involved with it, and just work out at this time, is there anything I can do to improve these three areas? And certainly from my perspective, we are giving out a lot of information on these three areas so that people can improve that in this lockdown period. We'll come on to the sport-related injuries in a second, and this area around sort of resting. Now, there are a couple of people that are probably watching this going, well, should I really be resting as much as I am at the minute? Well, I would say now that we're 4 or 5 weeks into lockdown, bodies have probably recovered pretty well. Now, the reason I popped that in there, though, is that a lot of us see athletes that don't really have many rest periods in their season. So many of them will go, let's say they're a footballer, they'll start their pre-season in sort of mid-July, they'll go through, the season ends in May, and then they'll have a couple of weeks off, and then they're back into pre-season. This is unusual, this time period, but we can use it to rest and rejuvenate our bodies. And if we're thinking of this as a time period to look at the injuries and old injuries and try and work on our weaknesses, this is a perfect time to do it. I'm going to challenge you as well to change your recovery behaviours. Again, this isn't a bad time to look at this and just sort of look at what you do within your weekly routine to try and improve yourself from a physical standpoint. Allowing your body to recover is the best thing that's going to enable you to carry on playing what you want to play without finding yourself injured at some point during the season. So if we're going to look at sports related injuries, all sports have commonalities in terms of what players seem to pick up over time. If I take basketball as a bit of an example, we know that within a squad, you're going to get 25% of the squad having an ankle injury at some point in the season. We've got a high level of tendon problems and lower back problems. So for everybody, you will be able to find commonalities in terms of what injuries your sports gets, whether you're rugby, hockey, runner, swimmer, whatever, you will have commonalities there. So find out what those commonalities are and use this time period to work on reducing the risk of those injuries. Tendon health is an interesting one. So our tendons like to be loaded, as we call it. By loaded, I mean they need to be challenged, and often people will call tendons as being a 365-day a year area to work on. If you're a runner and you've not ran for 3 or 4 weeks, then your tendons will, in theory, not be as good as they were 3 or 4 weeks before you stopped. So what I'm going to suggest to a lot of people now is to load up their tendons. Even if you're in a garden and you haven't got an awful lot of weight, you can still do body weight squats, lunges, etc. And those will start to challenge Achilles tendons and patella tendons, for instance. Those are probably some of the more common tendon problems that we'll get. There are a number of other areas that help maintain the health of tendons. However, loading them appropriately is probably the area that you'll benefit from mostly. Lower back pain is really common in not only in athletes but in sort of the general population, and we've got a bit of a challenge at the moment for a number of people that are now having to work from home or not working. They're doing a lot more sitting, and certainly at Bristol Physio we're finding huge amounts of our virtual patients that we're seeing on our video links. They are complaining of stiff backs, stiff mid backs as well, because often the work set up at home isn't as good. Again, use this time to build up that core, challenge your flexibility, challenge your stability, and those back pains will often reduce relatively quickly. Now, I've added in the growth-related issues. For some people that are watching this, you will have stopped growing potentially a long time ago. But I know that we're going to have kids or adolescents listening to this that are probably in the middle of their growth phase. It's probably not too unsurprising to all of us that kids get their growth spurts in the summer months. There's a lot of evolutionary theory behind this, but secondly, for a lot of kids that do winter sports, the summertime is a time when the body actually has a time to recover. And therefore, it's not uncommon to see kids grow potentially 6 or even 12 inches over the course of the summer months. Now, when we grow, our bones, especially the long bones, say the shin bone or the thigh bone, will grow much quicker than our muscles. And for everybody that is involved with an adolescent athlete, we have to be well aware of what consequences that brings to it. Most of the time, the soft tissues, your tendons and your muscles, will struggle to keep up with this rate of growth of the big bones, and therefore you can get growth-related tendon or muscular problems as a consequence. Most kids that grow really quickly will find their flexibility reduces rapidly, and their relative strength for their size reduces. Now, if you're an adolescent listening to this, this is completely normal. Don't worry about it. If you're a coach listening to this, what I would say to you is if you get a kid that comes back at the start of pre-season, whenever pre-season starts, and you notice that they've grown a number of inches, be well prepared for the stability and the performance of that individual to reduce. That's because if I'm playing hockey and all of a sudden I've got an extra couple of inches on my arms, I'm not going to be able to trap the ball as best as I was doing previously to me having my growth spurt. Again, like I say, it's completely normal, but you just need to be aware of these limitations that might occur at this moment in time. If you're the individual going through the growth spurts at the moment, you probably won't notice it particularly, other than the fact you might get a little bit more hungry, or the fact that your hamstrings start to get really, really tight. There is no harm in doing gentle flexibility work during this time, and certainly no harm in doing strength work at this time. I stuck the stability stuff in there. This is just around sort of encouraging you guys to work on simple stuff. So as you can see in this little video clip, I'm holding actually 6 kgs in my hand. I'm just doing a figure of 8 motion here. As I'm doing this, I'm challenging the ankle stabilizers, the foot stabilizers, my hip, my trunk, and my shoulders. It's a really simple exercise, but this is the type of thing that if you're doing a sport that involves lots of change of direction, football, rugby, hockey, whatever, then this is a really simple exercise just to try and challenge all of the neurons and the muscles to help keep you stable as you're doing your sport. Right. So before we move on to recovery, just to recap, please, if you've got any questions as I'm going through this, do jot it down. I can actually see the live feed here, so if you've got any questions, feel free to jump on. I'll see anything that you want. There's no stupid question out there. Okay, so when we're looking at recovery, what we often term the best recovery is the individual that just seems to do it naturally. And what I mean by that is often recovery for a lot of people is seen as a bit of a chore. It's seen as something that you don't necessarily want to do. However, the importance of recovery is really, really high. If you don't recover, your risk of injury goes up hugely. And there's tons and tons of evidence to say this. We at Basketball England have what we term a recovery pyramid, and this isn't unusual for many sports. The premise of this really is that if you don't do the base of the pyramid particularly well, then there's no point in looking higher up the pyramid at the other functions. So it's a bit of a fad, shall we say, for things like ice bath, well, not so much at the moment, but ice baths, protein shakes, maybe wearing skins or compression gear to aid recovery. But realistically, if your diet isn't particularly good, you're not getting good enough sleep, you're not foam rolling or doing your flexibility work and staying hydrated, then there's very little point in looking at having a protein shake after your gym session. So all I want you to take away from this, get the bottom of the pyramid right, and then you can start looking at periodization of training programs or looking at training diaries and things like that, because if you're not doing the other bits well, then there's no point in looking up higher. If we look at sleep at the moment, what I would say to you is that the experts out there are sort of depicting the general population as having of generally being in a sleep deficit at the minute. So what we mean by that is that for the vast majority of the population, we're not getting enough sleep. We need the sleep for a number of reasons. Clearly, mental health is massive at the minute, and it's a good topic, but sleep has a huge effect on positive mental health. We need it for the recovery of our general cells in our body and regulating bodily functions. Most people will require a minimum of 8 hours a night. So what I would suggest to all of you is to look at your at the amount of sleep you're getting per night and actually be honest with yourself. Am I getting a full night's sleep? And am I being able to wake up and look at my clock and say, oh yeah, I went to bed at 10, and I have actually slept through till 7, 6 or 7. Do bear in mind it takes us roughly about 20 minutes to get off to sleep, and because of sleep cycles we will go through light sleep and then heavy sleep. I won't go into that in too much detail, but effectively you're not going to get a full 8 hours if you go to bed at 10 and then wake up at 6. We effectively move into a jet lag situation if we don't have enough sleep. I'll come on to that in a bit. So I think with some of the experts looking at sleep at the moment, they are a little bit worried about some of the long-term effects of lack of sleep and whether that has any implications on other health problems moving forward, whether it's heart disease or probably more looking at things like dementia, Alzheimer's, things like that in a later life. As far as I'm aware, there's no evidence yet to say that there is a link between lack of sleep at say, mid-20s and then what happens later on in life, but I think people are looking into it. Okay, so what does it mean to go into a jet lag situation? Well, a lot of us will know what jet lag feels like, and it might not feel particularly good. But I think from a physical standpoint, we do see a reduction in our ability to fight the odd infections. Coughs and colds tend to be more prevalent when we're in a sleep-deprived state. We all get a bit more irritated generally across the board if we haven't got enough sleep. But we do certainly know that we have a massive lack of recovery as we're going through this sort of thing. From a mental perspective, reduction in brain function can obviously affect us on the pitch, on the court, and doing whatever you're doing. But obviously that might also have an effect whether it's in work or in school as well. We don't digest things as well, and that's an interesting one. If you're trying to maintain really good, healthy diet and you've got a lot of fibre in your diet, well, if you're not digesting it as well as you should do, then you're not going to get all the nutrients out of that. And this is an important point here. If you're lacking sleep, we tend to all have those poor diet choices. Now, for some of you, I hope that you have never experienced a hangover. For some other people, I'm sure a hangover is a relatively common theme. But we all know that hangovers potentially lead us to make poorer diet choices. And one of the factors about a hangover is that often many of us are struggling to get the hours of sleep in that we require. So not only have we piled loads of rubbish into our body the night before, then we're doubling that up with poor diet choices the day after. And this is a behavioural thing, and certainly something that if you recognise this is what's going to happen, you need to be able to change your behaviours at that point. But clearly our overall performance will reduce if we're going into a jet lag situation because of numerous factors that I've listed here. I'll touch on this a little bit. So we need to understand a little bit about how our patterns of sleep are for us individually, because none of us are the same. And I don't want to delve into this in too much detail, but we all have a circadian rhythm. It's very natural, and it's like our body's internal clock. If we can get enough sleep, then most of us will be able to be alert, regulate our normal body temperature, have good amounts of healthy hormones, and our cell activity will improve. And those things will all be a huge part of our recovery, really. In order to keep to our good circadian rhythm, we will therefore have to have regular times for going to bed and getting up. Now, I certainly did it through my teenage years and into probably up to the age of 35. I would get up in my normal time for work or training, but then at weekends we all tend to sleep in a little bit. And what they're telling us now, the researchers, is that potentially isn't the best thing for us. Our body is used to having that nice rhythm. So if, for instance, you're getting up at 7 for work 5 days a week, and then you're getting up at 10 AM at the weekends, this probably won't have a great effect on your circadian rhythm. However, many of us will sleep in because we've stayed up too late the night before, so we're trying to catch up with our 8 hours. But again, the researchers are telling us if we do stay up later, it's still worth getting up at the same time, exposing ourselves to sunlight early on because that will improve our alertness, and probably having to catch up on an hour's sleep in the middle of the day. Naps aren't a bad thing at all, but generally we would restrict the nap to about 45 minutes, and just one of those in a day. I know people that have a couple of naps in a day. Certainly screens are a big influence, and we're seeing, I think the researchers are looking at the effect of screens and stopping people from sleeping particularly well, and whether that has a knock-on effect to our mental health. So no screen times about 30 minutes to 60 minutes prior to going to bed. You want to de-stress by doing something a bit different. Having a warm shower helps regulate our body temperature. Believe it or not, it actually reduces our body temperature slightly, therefore allowing us to drop into a sleep a bit quicker. Caffeine is a potential big issue at the moment with things like Red Bull or other sort of caffeinated drinks. And certainly we would not recommend any caffeine 6 hours before going to bed. The half-life of caffeine, i.e. how long it stays in your body for, is surprisingly long. So if you have a cup of coffee at 10, for instance, the half-life of that caffeine floating around your system, it'll still be half of that caffeine will still be in your body at 4 p.m, so that's 6 hours later, but the quarter life will still be in your body potentially up to 10 to 12 hours after you've taken that caffeine in. So what we're saying there is if you have a cup of coffee at 10 a.m, you potentially still have some or a decent amount of that caffeine floating around in your body by 10 p.m. So that's just to give an example of how much caffeine might have an effect on you. Now, it's very individual, and no one will be able to sort of say exactly how the caffeine will affect you, but it's just well worth bearing that in mind when it comes to trying to sleep. If you're struggling to sleep, have a little think about what you've taken into your body sort of during the afternoon, for instance, because that might be having an effect on your sleep. No alcohol, that's a bit of a given really. It just means that you're able to nod off. And many people use alcohol to try and get them to sleep, but it certainly has a detrimental effect in most people. So in the bedroom, we want the room temperature to probably be below 20 degrees. Blackout curtains are a massive help for most people, and certainly don't have anything that will stimulate you. So phones, smartwatches, things like that, they shouldn't really be in the bedroom. I popped this in there at the moment. We're in this isolation time at the minute, and I think for a lot of us, we've gone from being surrounded by work colleagues, teammates on a very, very regular basis, and now we are often on our own or in a very small family group. I think we've also got other challenges with, say, university students who, again, they've been surrounded by quite a high social network, and they might well be back home with, say, mum and dad, or even living on their own. And that, for them, often is going to be quite tricky. And getting that change in circumstance is a really sort of interesting one to try and work out. So there's a lot in the media around mental health and isolation at the moment, but I think there's 4 sort of key areas that we sort of want to keep an eye on at the minute. So by keeping connected not only with our friends and family, but also teammates, work colleagues, etc., then you're able to share your worries and your concerns. And for most of us, we tend to not show our worries and concerns because we're athletes, and showing worries and concerns might mean that we're perceived as being slightly weaker. I would heavily encourage you to talk about any worries and concerns, whether it is linked with sort of athletic performance, whether it's linked with the current coronavirus, or for a lot of you guys out there, sort of the educational side of things. I know there's a lot of anxiety around exam results or degree results, etc. So those are there's no point in bottling them up. They won't go anywhere, so well worth talking about it and sharing those concerns with other people. From a mental health standpoint, we all know that physical activity tends to help regulate our mental state, and therefore many of us find doing some sort of exercise will help us maintain a good equilibrium there. So really, I'd encourage you to carry on doing some sort of physical exercise every day from a mental health perspective. And for most people, they find that creating a daily routine is really useful. So getting up at the same time, having breakfast at the same time, working for a certain amount of hours, doing some exercise, always sort of trying to tick that routine box. It does seem to help, for me it does anyway. So we are going to go on to some other bits and pieces, but just wanted to reiterate, please let me know if you've got any questions, if you want me to go back onto anything, talk about anything, and do feel free to drop us a line at Bristol Physio if you want to book in with any of us and talk about these things further. Right. I won't delve into this too much, but we're looking at thinking about conditioning. So you guys as athletes have probably reduced your conditioning at the moment, and each sport has their own sort of ideals in terms of conditioning and what you want to get out of it. So if you've got some strength and conditioning coach, a technical or tactical coach that has a bit of a background knowledge in conditioning, you need to tap those guys up now. You need to make sure that you're doing at home what you should be doing in terms of your sport. What we're pushing with our basketball players at the moment is going back and doing stuff that's really simple, and we've called them the fundamental movement skills, and a colleague of mine, Mark Williams, is really on this, and we're producing a lot of content around this. And the real premise of this is that every single sport, and I've got an example from basketball here, every single sport has to have general movement patterns or general movement skills that are key to allowing you to do your skill for your sport. So let's take a multi-directional sport, something like football. It's all very well being able to run in a straight line, but if you can't change direction, or you're poor at changing direction, then you won't be able to track that player, or you won't be able to make a break past the player. The change of direction is a real key fundamental movement pattern for that footballer, but quite commonly having a poor core, poor flexibility, poor stability, or even a previous injury might restrict you in that ability to change direction. Therefore, when we're looking at fundamental movement skills that we can do in our garden, for instance, then we're looking at trying to improve something as simple as a change of direction and all the elements that go with that. But it's the basis of all sporting movement, and if you've got a high level of good fundamental movement skills, then you'll also potentially have a high level of injury prevention, i.e. the less likely you are to have an injury. And at this time period where most of us are restricted to our living room or our garden, then we have to start looking at our movement patterns and whether we can sort of delve back into some of the simple stuff. Some of you will, some of you may know I'm working with a couple of potential Olympians. I hope they're watching this. And we're going back to basics with some of their stuff, which is probably really tedious for them. But with any luck, when the Olympic cycle kicks back in again, they will have massive reduction in injury rate, but secondly, I think their overall performance will probably improve because they'll be able to train harder for longer. These are just some examples of what I've been doing in my back garden. Some of you may have seen it on social media. But in simple terms, some of the fundamental movement stuff that we're looking at here is loading up, going through range with exercises, making sure it's nice and controlled, and the movement itself has got to be pertinent to your sport. So for instance, in the top right hand corner, the lunge there is very, very pertinent to a number of sports. Walking lunges will challenge your core and challenge that stability a little bit more. And we're obviously weight bearing through our feet, which for most sports you have to do. feel free to jump onto any of my social media to have a look at some other videos. Okay, cardiovascular work. So obviously we're restricted by government guidelines about getting outside of the house and doing 1 hour's worth of exercise at the moment. What I would suggest to all of you is that the cardiovascular work that you do has to be pertinent for your sport. What I mean by that, if I'm a horse rider and I get really, really good at running 10Ks at this moment in time, that's probably not going to help me for my sport. So this is where a good relationship with your strength and conditioning coach, your tactical coach might come in handy, because you can tap those guys up and say, right, what CV work do I need to be doing during this time? And for most of us who play multi-directional sports, I've got no problem with you going for a 10K run. But what I would suggest for you to do is do some sort of interval training within that, so that you are changing direction, you are running backwards, you're running forwards, you're running at different speeds, different paces, over potentially different terrains, so that you're really, really challenging yourself and your physical capabilities to do what you need to do for your sport. Certainly, we know from a mental health perspective that doing some sort of exercise is going to be good, so why don't you do this exercise that's going to be pertinent for your sport when the lockdown finishes? For many team sports, the building a base in terms of our cardiovascular fitness is really, really key. And it's interesting when you look at professional sports, say a sport like rugby, the cardiovascular fitness of players often increases during pre-season, which is what we'd expect, but then actually during the season, for a large proportion of the players, their cardiovascular fitness may well drop off during the season. And that's for a number of different reasons. But basically, if you can get your base really, really well or established during this time period, then you'll go into pre-season in a much better shape, and you'll be able to work on other elements during pre-season rather than having to build your base. Again, working with your tactical or technical coach will enable you to potentially use some drill work in there that will still be working your cardiovascular system, but you'll likely be able to add some sort of skill stuff into there that will be pertinent to your sport. And I've added the can we add some jump work in there, because jumping for a lot of sports is really, really important, even if you're a footballer, for instance, and our tendons will react quite well to doing a lot of jumping stuff. I'm not saying go out there and do loads and loads of jumping straight off the bat, because you've got to have good technique, but for most of us, if you can sort of push some good jumping work in this time, then you'll challenge your Achilles and your patellar tendons really, really well. Okay, so we're coming up towards the end of the stuff of my stuff. Like I say, please drop me a little bit of a question if you've got any. Right, I think what we all need to recognise at the moment is that we've got certain challenges out there. For you guys that are athletes of whatever level, you've probably got most of us are going through what we would term a low load time period at the moment, i.e. you're not doing as much as you normally would do. I think most of us will probably admit that we're not doing some of the training that we would need for our sport, or at least in enough depth. And for most sports that I deal with, we're probably not doing enough running or multi-directional movements. Therefore, our muscles will be deconditioning at the moment, and I think that then has a knock-on effect to tendons. So I think what we might well see when the lockdown ends is that people will go back into their sports really, really enthusiastically, and we might well see a spike in soft tissue injuries as a consequence of this. So my challenge for you really is to be able to go back into your sport without getting a soft tissue injury within the first 4 to 5 weeks of returning to sport. And if you're able to do some of the stuff we've talked about here, especially around the conditioning work, then you're much, much less likely to have a soft tissue injury once you head back into pre-season. I would sort of suggest that some of us will need to think about our body mass. For most athletes, you take in a huge number of calories during training and playing. But during this time when we haven't been doing so much, if you continue to take those calories on board, they might well increase your fat content. Clearly, for most of us, that isn't necessarily what we want out of this time period. So just be mindful of your diet and your exercise at the moment. And I mentioned it earlier about growth spurts. We've got to be careful of our adolescents that are coming into this. We've got to be careful that the adolescents who have growth spurts are not pushed too hard when they come back into sport. To give you an example, a lot of our basketball players at senior level, about 2/3 of them have tendon problems at the moment, and most of those can be historically stemmed back to and some sort of overload at some point in their athletic career, and for some of them that will be during their adolescent years. Unfortunately, commonly, once you have a tendon problem, it's quite difficult to get rid of it, and it might well flare up at any time. And what we don't want to see is lots and lots of tendon injuries occurring once the lockdown is finished. So I think what would be really, really useful for you guys, if you are in the middle of a growth spurt, do keep working on your flexibility, do some strength and conditioning work, because that'll be the best way of sort of maintaining some good health coming into the season. One of the challenges that you guys are going to have to face is that both you as individual athletes and your coaches will have spent potentially 3 months not doing an awful lot. So people will really want to get back into sport really, really quickly. What I see happening for a lot of pre-season is that you're going to have to plan your pre-season really well so that you're not overloading your body. And for the best coaches out there, they will be looking at their pre-season plan now in order to get it right once the lockdown's lifted. When that's going to be, no one knows, but I think being able to plan it and grade it so that you're all coming back into your sports in a graded manner would be the best way forward. Ian's asking about stretches that can help hamstring pulls. Ian, there are a number of different stretches, as you might imagine, out there. What I would say to you is that often the hips provide a bit of a key to hamstrings. If the hips are really nice and mobile, then that will often help as well. We are putting together a bit of a hip. My colleague Susie's put together a little bit of a hip mobility YouTube video that we'll stick on there probably Monday or Tuesday next week, and so we'll pop that onto our social media, so feel free to have a look at that. On our YouTube channel, we've got loads of different stretches and exercises for loads of different parts of the body, so feel free to jump on that. But for me, preventing hamstring pulls actually comes down to strength in our hamstrings, our glutes and our calves. We generically call that the posterior chain, and for a lot of sports we're quad dominant sports, which means we're sort of in a squat position. Basketball, hockey, squash are really good examples of that. So our quads develop bigger than our hamstrings and our glutes do. So one of the best ways to prevent hamstring injuries really is to actually get really strong through there. But effectively a stretch could be lying on your back with a straight leg, lifting that leg up above you. You might want to put a towel or a band on your foot, so you're giving that muscle a little bit more of a stretch. But in the long term, get strong through there. Okay. Now we're going to delve into maybe a little bit of stuff that might be too technical for some people. It might be enlightening for others. It might be far too simple for other people. It might all be based on what your previous experience has been. But in elite sport, we look at trying to manage load. And what I would say, this is quite a nice quote from Blaise Dubois. The body will adapt to our load as long as the applied stress, i.e. whatever activity you're doing, whether it's training in a gym or outside or sport-specific stuff, the applied stress is not greater than the body's capacity to adapt. So what I mean by that is if I was to go out and run a marathon today, trust me, my body would not have adapted to that, and I would be broken somewhere along the lines, probably my hamstring. However, I think if we have good management of load, and by load, I'll come on to what it means in a bit. If we have good management of load, then our reduction in injury rate is really, really high. So, what is load? Well, in our world, load basically means any physical or mental stress that is placed upon that individual, okay? And we require training to be a stimulus on the body that will then be able to enable us to tolerate more and more load. Okay, so quite a number of different sports in a number of different settings, you'll find that load is monitored, and I'll come on to how one simple way of doing it from our perspective. But effectively, we monitor it to reduce injury, because that increases your guys' playing time or training time, and we can probably improve fitness levels over the course of months, potentially even years, by having a graded and steadily progressing load for anybody. We should be looking as part of our load to develop our physical capabilities, and in our world, in basketball world, we're looking at improving our fundamental movement patterns, so that we can then improve our skill base on top of that. But what I would say to you, a lot of people, there is a perception, I think, that by monitoring load, we're looking to stop players from playing as much as they need to. We're certainly not doing that. We just feel that by monitoring the load, you are going to maximise the amount of time that you'll be able to play. Right. If you want to take a little bit of a snapshot of this, feel free. But this is one way to monitor load. It's not necessarily the best way, but it can be one of the more simple ways to do it. So we ask our athletes to give a rate of perceived exertion, i.e. how hard you found that session, and then a session RPE is that our rate of perceived exertion is multiplied by the duration of the session in minutes. You will end up with a unit of load for that time period, and you should, over the course of a week or over the course of a month, be able to work out how many units of load you as the individual are able to tolerate. Okay, I hope everyone's getting that. If I give an example, let's say I go to the gym and I work for a duration of 60 minutes, and I feel that gym session is a rating of 5 out of 10 on my rate of perceived exertion, with 0 being me sat on the sofa watching TV and 10 being I'm vomiting all over the place because I've done such a hard session. I'm going to get a unit of load of 300 units for that training session. Now, I might have been in the gym that morning, and then in the afternoon I go on to court and I do another 60 minutes at a RPE of 5. So by the end of the day, I've done 600 minutes of load. I can work that out for the rest of the week. I can then work that out for the rest of the month, and I can work out what I can tolerate over a certain amount of time. I'll give you a bit of an example. When I was working with the GB basketball women, we generally knew that our players could tolerate about 3,500 units of load a week, and therefore we designed things like this, which is before we even go into camp, we decide what the level and intensity of the training session should be for all of our players. So this is one that we designed before the Commonwealth Games in Australia in 2018, and just to give an example, this is purely examples, we then presented this to the coach, who can then plan his or her training sessions around what we are suggesting the load should be. Because what we don't want to do is find that by the time we come to the end of the week, we've done 6,000-7,000 units of load, and all of a sudden our athletes are breaking. I'll give you another example. This is a number of years ago, but we presented something like this to the coach at that time. When I say we, it's myself and a strength and conditioning coach, and ignored our advice and pretty much tripled the amount of load on the players in the first week, and then by week 3 of our training camp, we had about 35 to 40% injury rate, soft tissue injuries, so calves, hamstrings, groin muscles, things like that. So if we go back a slide, what I would say to you is that load can be coach-led and it can be player-led. So the coach can turn around and say, right, I've designed a 2-hour training session here. I'm going to say to my individuals that you're going to work, by the end of the session, I want you to work to a level of 8 out of 10. And that would be a really, really hard training session. But at the end of the session, the player might say, well, actually, I felt it was a 5 out of 10. And what that means is that the player was obviously comfortable in that training session, and potentially the coach could look back and say, well, actually, maybe I could have pushed that individual a little bit harder during that training session. That's not to say you have to, it's just a way of creating a dialogue between the player and the coach to say how well they thought the training session went and whether they felt it could be harder or not as hard. Now, in a team environment, it's a little bit more tricky to get the amount of load right for individuals, because for some players they might be able to tolerate 4,000-5,000 units of load a week, or for other players they might not be able to tolerate that amount, and you don't want to be pushing the player that can't tolerate it too hard, because otherwise they'll potentially injure themselves. In an individual sport, such as if I take a runner as a good example, then this is a really nice, easy way to say, right, how much load have I done this week? Can I push myself harder the week after? And if I push myself too hard, do I need further rest periods to reduce my load? Because if I keep pushing myself too hard over a long period of time, I'm likely to get a soft tissue injury. So this bit here is well researched, this bit at the end here. If we are getting too much load on our body and we're exerting it by too much over a short period of time, then we're likely to get soft tissue injuries. I hope that all makes some sense. Now, like I say, this is just one way of monitoring load. There are numerous other ways of doing it, and you can devise loads of different ways of doing it, but in very simple terms, this might be one way of doing it. So you can ask yourself a number of questions. You don't have to ask all of these, but these are just simple questions that you might want to ask yourself to see whether you feel as though you've recovered well enough from your previous training sessions. Do you feel all right the next day? Do you feel tired, fatigued, more so than normal, less so than normal? How much training or playing have I done? Have I actually played 3 games this week, competitive games, and now I'm feeling really, really tired? In which case I might need to take the weekend off, 2 days off, 1 day off, whatever. Is my hamstring a little bit niggly, Ian? I'm sure that maybe that's a little bit of a niggle that you're currently suffering with. So, is my hamstring a little bit tight? Do I need to give that hammy a little bit more of a rest? Have I recovered well? Have I got my 8 hours of sleep in? Is my diet up to scratch? Do I need to hydrate further? Do I need to add a rest day in there? Do I have any other stresses at the moment? I mean, it's well documented that if you've got, for instance, exams coming up, then your cortisol levels, which are your stress hormones in your body, they'll go up in your body, and increased levels of cortisol in the body unfortunately lead to soft tissue injuries as well. So you might well be prone to pulling that hamstring that you've got that tight niggle in if you go out and train at the same intensity. And one that I would always ask people, are you enjoying your sport at the moment? Because there is something called overtraining syndrome, where you find people may be training too hard, too often, and they're not recovering particularly well, and they lose the enjoyment of the sport. And this is where we see a lot of younger athletes that are potentially very good athletes that might be playing at a very high level, and they walk away from the sport at a later date because they've been pushed too hard, too soon, and they haven't found the enjoyment out of their sport. So for any individual, be it an athlete or a coach, you've always got to ask yourself the question, am I enjoying it? If you're not, then you might need to just look at your training regime. So I've talked at you for a wee while there, but what I want to really sort of reiterate is that there are things that you guys, whether you're a coach or whether you're a player, should be doing at the moment. And I think for all of you, you need to see this lockdown period as an opportunity to try and improve your physical performance. If you're a coach, the key to maintaining or pushing that individual to get a better performance is going to be communication. You need to be able to communicate with your players, find out what they're doing now, what they're looking at doing over the course of the next couple of weeks, and is there anything that you as the coach will want that individual to improve on over the time. You need to utilise some of the practitioners that you've got around you. If you're fortunate enough to have strength and conditioning coaches or therapists around you that might be able to offer advice to your athletes, tap them up. Don't sit there. Many people in our profession at the minute aren't doing as much work as they normally would be at the moment, so they might well have time to help you out. But do get in contact with those people that might be able to help you and your athletes moving forward. Plan for your pre-season. Now, none of us are going to know when the season's going to start yet, but I think in an ideal world, given the time period that we've had out from playing, I would be asking people to plan a pre-season of about 6 to 8 weeks. If you're able to slowly improve physical fitness in a graded manner over the course of that pre-season, then you'll hit the ground running once the season starts. What I certainly wouldn't want you to do is plan huge numbers of load, should we say, in the first 2 or 3 weeks, because you will break your players and then you'll have a number of players that are sitting on the sidelines come the start of the season. This last one here is a bit more aimed at some of the old school coaches that we see out there. I'm not a mega fan of physical punishments. For instance, if you're not doing what you should be doing in the training session, go and do a number of suicides up and down the court or the pitch. I think there are better ways to improve people's concentration during a training session rather than make them run up and down. For adolescents that are playing a lot of schoolboy hockey, rugby, cricket, athletics, netball, whatever, adding extra load in there by making them do a physical punishment probably isn't what we're going to need out of our athletes. Anyway, that was a little dig at coaches. As players, please recognise that this is a massive opportunity to improve yourself. Be aware of the performance gains that you can get at this moment in time, and be aware that you can challenge some of your recovery behaviours and other behaviours that are associated with your athletic development at the minute. Recognise where you might not be strongest in your athletic development and put plans in place to try and push those along. Attempt to do as much of the conditioning work as you feel able to at the minute. What you do now will have a massive effect on your sporting prowess in the next season, potentially the next few years, if you can use this time period really well. So I would heavily push you to attempt to do as much as you can from that perspective, and then use this time to prevent further injuries, whether you're looking at some of the older injuries that you might have picked up in previous seasons and rehabbing those to the best of your abilities, or looking at your sport and understanding what the common injuries are in your sport. You can use this time to prevent those injuries moving forward. So I probably have waffled long enough on all of that stuff. Just wondered, has anyone got any other questions that they want to pose at the moment? They're not jumping out at me on the screen, which is either a sign that you've all fallen asleep or you've switched off, which is fine. That's fair enough. Well, listen, if there are no other questions, please feel free to drop us a line at Bristol Physio if you've got any further questions moving forward. Let us know if you want to pop in and see us. We're conducting video consultations at the minute, and all of our practitioners will be able to see you along that sort of line. If you want to drop me an email or hook me up on social media, there my links at the bottom of the page there, and you should be able to I'll be able to reply in good time. But what I'll do is got a question from Scott here around hydration. So hydration, yeah, it's really interesting when you look at some of the evidence around what is in some of our electrolyte drinks, for instance. Then I think what we'll find from a lot of them is that the sugar content in them is really, really high. In terms of what the best stuff out there is, I would always go for established brands. If you're an athlete that is fortunate or unfortunate to be monitored by UK anti-doping or WADA, some of the other doping sort of elements, then I think you will find that you can only have a restricted number of different brands that you can go for anyway. But we've used a number of different brands over the years, but they're always linked with UK anti-doping and things like that. Water certainly is one of the best ways to hydrate. One of the issues with water, though, especially if you're trying to replenish your hydration levels after, say, a heavy training session, is that you'll find that you end up peeing for half the night. So what we would do is then tend to put a electrolyte tablet into the water. The electrolyte tablet basically enables you to take in more water. The cells will actually literally suck up more of that fluid without having to fill your bladder up and end up going for a wee 3 or 4 times in the night. So water is definitely extremely good for you, but you can have supplementation within that water to help you enable you to stop peeing throughout the night. I think that's probably the best I can give you in terms of hydration. I think if you were during the day and you wanted to replenish yourself after, say, a long bike ride, I would just stick with water, and then your normal diet should help you replenish those electrolytes. There's another question actually around protein shakes. I think from UK, interesting. Firstly, if you're going to take any supplementation, you need to make sure that it's not a banned substance and it comes from a reputable source. Certainly we tend to use Science in Sport. I would so SIS do a number of good brands, and I think what you need to understand with your protein supplementation or any sort of extra supplementation is, what do you want out of it? Because there are so many different types out there. Are you literally looking for a high protein post workout supplement that might well help you recover better? Do you need extra carbohydrate in there because you've done, for instance, a long bike ride? You'll need to get extra carbohydrate in there alongside of the protein. And so your best, if you've got the option of talking to a nutritionist that knows your sport and knows what you require, then that would be the best thing for you. If you haven't, I would jump on some of the websites out there that would probably push some good supplementation, but they might have a really good explanation on what each product does so that you can get the best out of that. I hope that answered your question, Kate. Okay, are there any other questions out there? Yeah, Paul, we'll definitely put it onto our YouTube once we've downloaded it. I'll let Charlotte do that because, yeah, me and the tech probably won't like that. Great. Well, if everyone's sort of happy with that, we'll leave it there. But feel free to obviously drop me a line, hook me up on social media, come and see us at Bristol Physio if you need anything in the future, and we'll go from there. Lovely. Take care, guys, and best of luck over the next season, and utilise this time as best you can. Take advantage